Jordan Peterson, welcome to Australia. Now tell me, what are your impressions of the country post-pandemic?
Well, it's open again, so that's nice. I like coming here. I'm very gratified that I've been received positively. I had a huge crowd in Brisbane, 10,000 people, and there's a bigger show coming up in Sydney. I think there's 13,000 there. So those are the biggest audiences that have attended my shows, single shows. And so that's very interesting to see. Nothing really on the protest front. I saw a bit of buzz online before I came here that there were people on the more radical left side that were going to show me just exactly how unwelcome I was here. But so far, unsurprisingly, they haven't managed to organize themselves. Right. So the last time I was here too, it's a very impressive country. And today I'm here in Canberra speaking with parliamentarians, and that was quite surprising to me that I was invited and that there were a large number of people in attendance. That's a surprising and I would say at least somewhat courageous act. It's not clear to me at all that would happen in Canada, for example.
And do you find conservative politicians, including ours, are crying out for some direction in how to communicate the message and how to stop apologising and
absolutely.
Actually...
Yeah, well, conservatives are pretty good at implementing. That's their strength, even on the temperamental side. But on the vision front, they're not that good. And that's partly what even makes them conservative, because if you're a conservative, you don't need a vision in some sense, because what you tend to do is walk the tried and true path. And in some sense, that's a replacement for a vision, or it's a traditional vision. And the disadvantage you have, I would say, on that front is that when people push you in relationship to your traditional vision, you may not be able to articulate it well. So someone might object to someone who's conservative. It's like, well, defend marriage. It's like, well, people think, well, I thought we already agreed on that. I don't know how to defend that. It's an institution that's been around for all intents and purposes forever. It's part of the general consensus of value. Even to articulate it to that degree is rare. And so conservatives are often taken aback, especially when those questions are also accompanied by a moral accusation. Like, well, it's nothing but a patriarchal institution. And it's also easy to make conservatives feel guilty because they're conscientious. Yeah. And so if you tell a conservative, you're not doing your duty, they think, oh, well, I'm not. I'm trying to do my duty.
But is that a losing strategy? Is that why the left's march through the institutions has been so successful? Because conservatives haven't had that boldness and belief in their value system?
Well, I think it's also because the challenge is actually quite realistically corrosive. So we could start with the observation that all human social institutions, whether they're micro, marriage say, or macro, political or economic, are corrupted by the corruption of power. So when someone drives the assault against an institution forward on the basis of the claim that it's nothing but power, it's difficult to differentiate that because you're guilt prone as a conservative, you'll think, well, yeah, these institutions are corrupted by power to some degree. Well, then that's the rub. It's like, well, yeah, to some degree. To say that our institutions are corrupted by the temptation of power is a very different claim than that those institutions are founded on nothing but the will to power. And that's the fundamental radical, what would you say, leftist claim. And that's not an easy claim to defend against. Because I might say, like I could confront you with this, I could say, well, what's the opposite of the will to power? And you think, well, I don't know. So, well, that's a problem. And it is a problem. It's a very difficult technical problem. I think, by the way, just for the sake of continuing the argument, that it's the spirit of voluntary play that's the antithesis of the spirit of power. And I think that functional human relationships that are self-sustaining and productive and generous, reciprocal, are when they're optimized based on the spirit of play. And that's the opposite of the spirit of tyranny as well. But it took me like 30 years to be able to figure out how to articulate that. And so if you're pushed back into a corner with your rather inarticulate but deeply embodied conservative beliefs, it's not evident at all that you have either the ability or the temperament to transform that traditional belief into a compelling, forward-looking vision. So that's very hard on conservatives, and I have been struck by the degree to which the vision on the centrist front is neither compelling nor coherent. It's not, especially in the face of this tremendously pointed accusatory assault. It's all about power. And the only reason you don't see that is because of your privilege. It's like, well, you have privilege. I mean, you're in a good position. Do you not have privilege? Well, what do you mean privilege exactly? Did you earn it? Well, can you even earn privilege? Is there such a thing as earning it? Well, these are all questions that have been thrown up by people who are subsidized to do nothing but cause trouble as a consequence of their envy.
But how does that contrast with, say, a belief system that's centred on political correctness? Because that's quite easy to articulate and understand, those sort of belief systems.
Well, it's also an effective call to a very base motivation. So if you put forward the proposition that it's all about power, then, and that those who have more power have it because they have essentially stolen it, well, then all sorts of things are now open up for you. It's like, well, anyone who has more than you of anything is a thief. That's quite the proposition. It's very convenient for you. You're justified in stealing it back. In fact, you might be morally obligated to do so. You have a convenient place to put the problem of evil, and it's certainly not within you. It allows you to act on your envy. And boy, you want to be careful of adopting a belief system that allows you to act on your envy, because envy is a very, very, very corrosive motivational force. You know, and if no one can have anything more than anyone else, no one can have anything at all, because everything is never going to be absolutely equitably distributed.
And yet, so much of what we see now is trying to manufacture equity. It's not about equality, it's about having equitable outcomes. And that seems to be something that's illogical, but yet it's an ideal that's held up.
It's attractive too, in some sense, right? Because if you're, and it's attractive in an instinctive way, in some sense. If you're walking down the street and you see someone who's homeless, it's going to produce a stirring of conscience, right? At least you feel, well, that's unfortunate. You might think there, but for the grace of God. You're going to think, wouldn't it be better if society was constituted so that such things did not occur? You might think that person has been victimized and oppressed, and it certainly might be the case in their particular case. And so that sets you up with a moral conundrum. And if you're given an easy explanation for that also appeals to your base motives, then you're very likely to jump at it, and maybe even to apply it to yourself. And so it's easy to make that viewpoint attractive, and it takes education to make that viewpoint not attractive. So, I mean, I think that almost all societies that have become successful have done so by educating themselves in some real sense out of an instinctive false compassion and envy. And because those are there at hand, they always have to be, what would you say? They always have to be pushed back against. They always have to be differentiated. So what's the difference between wealth and theft? Well, someone might not come up with that idea on their own, but once it's presented to them, especially to a young person, especially given that the system is not fair in the ultimate sense, it presents a very difficult conundrum. Especially also because some people do have more than others because they're psychopathic and manipulative, Machiavellian, and they don't play fair. So, for me, the miracle is that there are any societies at all where that isn't the case all the time, where the tyrants just aren't victorious. And one of the things I really like about the ethos of the West is that I think the central ethos of the West is precisely the spirit that moves effectively against tyranny, is not the cause of tyranny. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't tyrannical elements of the West, because of course there are. But what I'm very afraid of on the radical front is that to the degree that the radicals even want what they want, they're pursuing it in a manner that's so counterproductive that if they were victorious, it would destroy the very thing they purport to support.
Oh, absolutely. So. Well, your good friend Douglas Murray has written about this war on the West. How do we prevail in the age of unreason?
The only way to prevail is to tell a better story, right? And you need a better story than the Marxist story. And I think the story of meaning through responsibility is a better story. And it's a core, you might think about it as, it's certainly the core Christian story, meaning through responsibility. I mean, I suppose responsibility extended to the ultimate degree is something like voluntary self-sacrifice to the highest good. It's something like that. Because to take responsibility means to forego immediate gratification in the service of something longer term and higher, right? It literally means it's a sacrificial gesture to take responsibility, and the ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of the self to the highest good, and that's exemplified by the image of the crucifixion. It's exemplified by the Passion story, and that's the central sacrifice upon which our cultures are founded. It's even literally the case. I was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem recently with Jonathan Pajot, and that was the first Christian church, and it's hypothetically founded on the very spot where Christ was crucified. And so the church marks the point of optimal sacrifice. And so then the church becomes the center of the community. So the center of the church is the point of self-sacrifice. The church is the center of the community. That's what happened in Jerusalem when it was refounded by the Emperor Constantine's mother. And then that became the literal model for the establishment of towns and cities throughout Europe. This is literally how the culture was founded. And that divine sacrifice is the voluntary adoption of ultimate responsibility. And that's the correct story. And so, and we don't know that. We don't know that that's the central story, not consciously. We're struggling towards making that conscious. And for this, I believe that for the culture to be set back up on its foundations, we're going to have to return to the origins and know the place for the first time, in T.S. Eliot's words.
Now you have an enormous impact with young men, and I speak to mothers of young men, and so many of them, whatever their political persuasion, are really concerned about the crisis amongst boys, the anti-male sentiment that we hear so much about in popular culture, toxic masculinity, male privilege, all these sort of negative messages. How do we counter that? What would be your message to mothers of young boys?
Part of what you do is you counter that in the home first, to the degree that a mother might be motivated by a resentful quasi-feminist ethos. That's going to manifest itself in her son's life. It's like, well, I'm antagonistic to the patriarchy. Okay, so what do you mean by that? The patriarchy, is that a manifestation of the central spirit of masculinity? Or what is it? Because if it's not that, then what is it? Well, let's say it's that. Well, your son's masculine, so how do you think your attitude towards masculinity is going to work for him? You're going to treat him like he's a baby patriarchal oppressor? Or that his ambition is part of the force that rapes and pillages the planet, and that idea is sort of lurking at the basis of all your interactions with him? You think that's going to go well? That's the devouring mother from the Freudian perspective. That's not going to go well. And so it's good to remember, if you're a mother, when you talk about the patriarchy, you're talking about your son.
But even in boys' schools, even in education centres that are supposed to be devoted to good outcomes for boys, there is just so much unrelenting messaging about toxic masculinity and male privilege. I just wonder, what impact does that have on young men growing up?
We know what impact it has on them. They just drop out. Why wouldn't they? So imagine they're actually ethical. Their boys are ethical in their fundamental orientation. So then they hear that their desire to engage in rough and tumble play, their desire to point and shoot at things, for example, which is deeply masculine, deeply human for that matter, because we point and shoot and aim at things. That's our entire physiological platform. We're hunting creatures. and that so your ambition is nothing but a manifestation of the corrupt and oppressive patriarchy. And as he said, you're part of the force that destroys the planet. If you have a shred of ethical sense and you're a young man, that's just going to stop you. It's going to just demotivate you. And in some sense, that's the purpose, because women who are afraid of men confuse competence with power, and then they believe that the road to peace is the antagonism to power. And because they don't discriminate between power and competence, they become antagonistic to their son's competence, and then they reap exactly what they sow. They end up with incompetent boys. Well, what went wrong? It's like, well, how about you discouraged every sign of competence, every chance you had? I read this account a while back. A woman author in the United States, whose name I don't remember, talked about just how difficult it was to stop her son from playing with guns. She said, well, I took every gun out of the house, or even anything that remotely looked like a gun, and that boy, he'd take the toothbrush and shoot the cat with it. And how appalling is that? It's like, oh, you're quite the monster, aren't you? You saw something manifest in your son that was so deep, this desire to point and shoot, let's say, that despite your best efforts, you couldn't crush it. And then you didn't even notice that you were spending all of that time trying to crush it, and it was so deep that you couldn't, and you still regarded what you were doing as a virtue. It's like, boy, your son, he certainly needs a new mother. That's for sure. So
I worry, though, also about girls, because academically they're doing much better from preschool all the way to university.
Do a little rough on the mental health front.
Exactly, on the mental health front. And I wonder, being told you're a victim, that you're oppressed, even though if you live in the West, what does that do to the female psyche of a young woman growing up? Thinking
It definitely increases the degree to which young women are anxious and depressed, because it makes them self-conscious. And we know the more you think about yourself, the more unhappy you are. And it's such a striking phenomenon that if you look at this statistically, there's almost no difference between self-conscious thoughts, so thoughts that involve I, let's say, and suffering from the ravages of negative emotion, like emotion and depression. And so this obsessive self-centeredness, narrow self-centeredness, just makes all of that suffering much, much worse. So that's clearly the case. And a victim is someone to whom things constantly happen involuntarily. And if you construe yourself as a victim rather than as an actor, let's say, then as an actor of your own destiny, then you put yourself in a situation where you're constantly under what your body responds to as stress. So that's clearly no good. And then I think there's another factor many other factors that are confusing young women. Confusion on the sexual front, the idea that if you're properly liberated, then the entire gamut of sexual freedom opens itself up to you, and that's how life should work. It's just that's just not true at all. It's especially not true for women. I mean, I've been toying with the idea, and I think this might be right, that it's the capacity to say no that gives young women status. That's actually the base. So imagine that young women are competing for young men of status. So then the question is, and maybe they're at a disadvantage because they want higher status males, right? So that puts them at a perennial disadvantage, and there's some truth in that. So then what do the women have as a buttress against that status differential? And I would say all they have is the ability to say no, because when you say no as a young woman to a desirable young man, you're saying, I have something to offer you that won't just be given away, despite the fact that you're of high status. And so you blow that apart in the name of sexual freedom. I think you deprive young women of all their status. It's not like the young men don't know that. They know that perfectly well. They respect young women who say no. They might complain and cavil and carp about it, but when push comes to shove, and the data on this are quite clear.
Well, it seems a lot of the women's liberation movement of late, the sexual liberation and that you spoke about, it seems to advantage men far more than women.
Well, no, it doesn't.
Well, because they get the sex without the responsibility.
Yeah, but it doesn't disadvantage men. It disadvantages a very small proportion of hyper-successful and increasingly predatory men.
Yes.
because it disadvantages most men, because what happens is that when the sexual constraints are lifted off women, they all migrate to a very small percentage of men, 5% maybe, and then those men have an almost unlimited field of sexual access, and so you could say that's of benefit to them, but it's not, because it trains them to be manipulative, Machiavellian, instrumental psychopaths, because all they're doing is pursuing a string of pleasure-based, hedonistic, short-term relationships. That's bad training if you want to be a reciprocal human being, and if you want to learn how to participate in a real relationship. So, and then it's catastrophe for the women, because none of those men are incentivized to form anything that approximates a long-term relationship. And then the rest of the men are left with nothing. Yeah, so that's
disastrous for society.
Disastrous, yeah, it's disastrous.
These trends we're seeing, it was very interesting in the midterms to see some polling showing that unmarried women are becoming a significant voting bloc for the Democrats. Something like 2 in 3 vote Democrat. Now, why do you think that is? Why is it that married men and married women are gravitating towards the Republicans, and unmarried women, according to these exit polls, are opting for the Democrats?
Well, why it's unmarried women is harder to parse out. Why it's women is relatively easy to understand. I looked technically with one of my students at what predicted politically correct belief, and one of the big predictors was feminine temperament, but over and above feminine temperament was being female. So there is a tilt towards the left that seems to characterize femininity, and you might ask yourself, why? So let's imagine for a moment one source of the intrinsically female ethos. All right, so women have to be infant-centered. In fact, I think women's nervous systems are optimized for the mother-infant dyad and not for individual women. So women are more sensitive to negative emotion. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for that. Women are more vulnerable sexually and physically. So it would make sense for them to be more responsive to threat. But then you could add an additional layer, which is, well, yeah, they also have to take primary responsibility for very dependent infants. And so it would make sense for someone whose life is characterized by that intense dependent dyadic relationship to be more sensitive to negative emotion. Okay, and so what would that mean? Well, it would mean in part to be prone to defending the infant. Well, that's woke culture in some sense. So on the woke side, imagine for the instinctive female ethos, here's the world. There are 3 categories. That's all, 3 categories. Infant, caretaker of infant, predator. That's it. So you're either an infant, like a university student who's victimized, or you're a caretaker, like a university administrator who's infantilizing the university students, or you're a predator. Well, and if you're a predator, no quarter is given. So it's a necessary ethos, because if you have an infant, you should bloody well be alert for predators. And if you're false positive, say, well, that's a predator and it isn't, oh well, you've protected your baby. Might be a little hard on the predator. Right? So it's okay if you err in the direction of oversensitivity to predation signs. I think that's the fundamental female ethos. And when that's manifest politically, well, you see sympathy for the more progressive causes that transform the world in some sense into infant and predator.
Well, is that trend more evident in unmarried women? I mean, it's evident in Australia as well. Under 35 women are more likely to be single than not. So we're going into motherhood later. There's a lot more who are childless. And I wonder if that's substituting one for the other.
It is substituting, I think. I think what happens to most women when they have an infant is they start understanding that, oh, that's an infant. All these other quasi-infants, they're not infants. They start to be able to distinguish. And we have to ask ourselves seriously, with that instinct towards bonding and protection, if it isn't given its target, how does it manifest itself in the political and economic sphere? And well, I think we're seeing that. It's that, well, if you don't have the proper focus for your infant-oriented ethos, you construe the world within the confines of that ethos. And it isn't obvious to me at all. We don't know this, of course, So women have entered into the political arena en masse in the last, say, 50 years, something like that. They become a political force. We don't know if the female ethos scales, right? So if the female ethos is intimate, especially in relationship, say, to the infant-mother dyad, but maybe with regard to personal relationship as well, that might have a scalability limit. So Ben Shapiro told me, well, I run my family like it's a communist utopia. It's to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. Well, that doesn't scale. And it isn't obvious to me that instinctive female ethos scales politically. Now you might say, well, of course it can. It's like, no, let's not get the cart before the horse here. Human beings are the only creatures who can scale their social organizations the way we manage it. And that scaling is a consequence of the manner in which men interact with one another. That's the whole claim of those who criticize the patriarchy. So that masculine ethos scales. Now it's a bit impersonal, it's a bit distant. It doesn't have the same intimate nature as, say, the mother-infant bond, but there's no evidence at all that that central feminine ethos scales. Now we're experimenting with that. Can it scale? It's like, well, do we transform the world into infants and caretakers and predators? And if we do that, is that going to sustain itself? I would say the evidence isn't it's not obvious to me that that's either scalable or iterable. It's a deep problem, and it's one that no one will address.
Well, yeah, these are the sort of issues we don't really discuss in any meaningful way. The trends we're seeing, whether they're desirable, and you've spoken about the rates of depression, the rates of suicide we're seeing in these prosperous, peaceful nations, which should be, heaven on earth, and yet there's this deep
identity crisis.
Yeah, where does that come from? Is it that lack of responsibility, lack of meaning in life?
I think it is that to a large degree. It's a consequence of something like a pathologically prolonged immaturity, because I do think that the meaning that sustains and that iterates and unifies socially is based on an ethos of responsibility. That's the advantage to maturity. And you can certainly put forward the question, well, why should you grow up? That's the eternal question of Peter Pan. And I think the answer to that is because, all things considered, it's much better to grow up. Well, what does better mean? It's a better game. It's more sustainable. It's more socially uniting. It's more productive. It's more generous. All of that. And I don't think we know that well enough consciously. We can't communicate that, or haven't been able to communicate that effectively to young people. Certainly for a long time. It's at least since the early 60s that there's been anything like a cultural consensus that even should be communicated to young people. And then, you have the corporate dollars chasing the childhood and teenage market. Teenagers have disposable income. They're a target of a lot of messaging. And so the elevation of adolescence to something like an ideal has also been driven by corporate interests. And people often, I remember when I was a teenager, people would say, these are the best years of your life. And I looked around at my friends and I thought, God, I hope not, because nobody I know is the least bit happy. We have this elevation of this immature adolescent, unfinished identity as the apotheosis, right? And it's all downhill from when you're 16. It's like, God, that's a dismal view. And I also don't believe that it's true. It's fundamentally false. And it's very demoralizing for young people, because if they can't see any advantage in being an adult, or if there is no advantage, why would you bother growing up? And certainly men who are bailing out of the enterprise en masse, that's their attitude. It's like, well, I don't want to play that game. I'm done. You're not going to reward me for taking on responsibility? You're going to punish me for doing so? It's like, I'll just go play video games with my friends.
Now, you are very popular in the Muslim community as well, which I was surprised to learn. You've got a lot of readers and listeners in that community. But you copped some criticism because you had a message about Muslims coming together, getting over that sectarian divide. Why do you think there was a strong reaction to that?
I think it was a bit unsophisticated, what I did, so I think there was some grounds for the criticism. What I was trying to put forth and have been trying to put forth in my, say, interfaith dialogue is, look, Jews, Christians, Muslims, if you think each other are the enemy, you're not paying attention. You got bigger fish to fry. If you think other people of the book are your primary competitors, you're living in a dream world, because the woke, atheistic, reductionist materialists pose a way greater threat to the integrity of your religious traditions than other people of the book, let's say. And then I was also trying to make the case in that message to Muslims that the proper jihad might be something like, get your house in order, right? You've got sectarian divides within your own community. Well, why don't you rectify them? And if you want to advertise Islam as the saving doctrine of the world, then be a Muslim so compelling that people are voluntarily inclined to imitate you. That's the right jihad. And that's what I was attempting to communicate, in a rather awkward way. And because I did it somewhat awkwardly, it got criticized as high-handed, but it was okay. It went fine. It didn't interfere with my attempts to continue speaking. And I also think it was motivated to some degree because there are Muslim leaders who are irritated about the fact that I'm popular among Muslim young people, because I'm not a Muslim, and so that's annoying. And just like it's annoying to the Christians that I won't come out and proclaim my Christian faith, let's say. They'd rather it was someone from within the community. But c'est la vie, I'm the ethical outsider in an archetypal sense, and that's how it is.
Do you feel a sense of responsibility, given your popularity in the Muslim community, to Muslim women? Because their plight is very different to women in the West. Seeing right now in Iran an uprising amongst women who are fighting against the hijab laws. We know really Muslim majority countries, women don't have equal rights like we enjoy in the West. Do you feel any sense of responsibility there to perhaps speak up on their behalf as well?
Well, I have been reaching out to protesters in Iran. We haven't been able to arrange a podcast so far, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, logistic and otherwise. I've been doing what I can since I've been back on Twitter to retweet messages from Iran when I have the opportunity to do that. I would say my responsibility, where's the center of my responsibility? I believe that policy that relies on compulsion is bad policy. And I don't think that forcing women to behave in a certain way, forcing them, is an optimal strategy. I mean, we do know, for example, that one of the best predictors of socioeconomic development in an emerging economy is the rights accorded to women. And that's very interesting. And I would say that's probably because that's something like an indicator of how open the culture is to novel and revolutionary ideas. If you can't tolerate your own women, the probability that you'll be able to experiment with the ideas that might lead to creative renovation is extremely low. And so it looks to me like the extension of education and the right to engage in voluntary associations to women is overwhelmingly a net good. Now, I say that also understanding that the more traditionalist communities, which include many Muslim communities, are leery of that notion of freedom from tyranny becoming extended to the point where it's, well, everything goes, because that's where we've ended up in the West, and that's just not a good idea. I did a seminar on Exodus recently with a number of scholars, which the Daily Wire Plus is releasing tomorrow on the 25th of November, and people might find that interesting. One of the things that we discussed in that regard was what God told Moses to tell the tyrant Pharaoh. And this is a civil rights rallying cry. Let my people go. Everyone knows that phrase. But that isn't what God said. He said two things. He said, let my people go so that they may serve me in the wilderness. Right? And that's actually, the second half of that is just as important as the first half, because to be completely free from constraint you might think, well, that's the absence of tyranny. It's like, well, it is. But it's also the presence of the desert. You know, the Israelites get lost in the desert. They're aimless. They're wandering. They don't know which way is up. Well, that's freedom without principle. That's freedom without the rules of the game being properly intact. To serve God in the wilderness is to move from the compulsion of tyranny to a principled mode of being. And then the question arises, what's the optimal principled mode of being? And part of that's examined in the Exodus story as well. It's part of the mystery that the entire biblical corpus is trying to solve. But it's not hedonic freedom to pursue every momentary whim. And when the traditionalists, conservatives, and let's say Muslim traditionalists, Orthodox Jews, traditional Christian thinkers, look at the hedonistic tilt of the liberal West, they can't separate that from the clarion call, let's say, to free women from their oppression. And you can understand that, because proper freedom isn't hedonistic whim. That's just chaos. That's immaturity of a radical sort. It's not self-maintaining or self-advancing. It isn't the basis for a stable society. And the traditionalists have every reason to view that push from the West, the idiot West, with extreme skepticism. And that also means that in some sense the radicals who advocate for radical freedom are their own worst enemies, because they give freedom itself the kind of bad name that enables the more tyrannical conservative types, say on the religious front, plenty of ethical justification to maintain their iron grip. I've been watching Kamani on Twitter, and he's an anti-chaos guy, you know. The strength of the state. And why is that attractive? Well, it's partly attractive because people look at the hedonistic immaturity of the West and they think, well, that doesn't look like a solution. And they're right. So then you have a complex question. Well, what's the proper solution? What does it mean to follow the dictates of the highest spirit as you sojourn through the wilderness? It's like, well, conservatives better figure out what that means, because that's the message they need to deliver to lead the way forward properly, to be the proper antithesis to the utopian hedonistic globalists, let's say.
And that plays into how you became well known around the world, because you warned about the excesses of the trans movement, about this submission to language, not ceding linguistic territory to radicals. And what you warned about just a few years ago, are you shocked by how far we've come since then? I mean, did you think it would become that advanced, the excesses of
Yes.
you saw it coming?
Well, I told the Senate that if they confused young people about their sex, they would produce a psychogenic epidemic. There's a literature on such things going back 300 years. And so imagine that there are a subset of often young female adolescents. So women hit puberty younger than men, so they're not as mature when the burden of adult sexuality descends upon them. And women are very harshly judged for their appearance, much more so than men. Although men are very harshly judged for their perceived proclivity for productive generosity, let's say. So there's harshness on both sides. But women definitely bear the brunt of that on the physical attractiveness side. And so girls are more prone to negative emotion than boys, for reasons we've already discussed. And a lot of that's body-centered. And a lot of girls really struggle with that. And it makes them anxious and depressed and wondering about their identity, which you should wonder about when you're transforming from a child into an adult. Obviously, you're going to worry about your identity. Well, a lot of those young women are barely hanging on. So what do? Confuse them further. So what's the consequence? Well, a number of them they're just done. They just descend into utter mad chaos. And you produce an epidemic. Well, I knew that was coming. It was absolutely crystal clear. I told the first trans activists who opposed me, you think I'm your enemy. I'm not. I just know that what you're doing will not even work by your own standards. I know it.
And we are seeing these detransitioners already.
Oh, yeah.
And
there's 1,000 lawsuits against the Tavistock Clinic in the UK.
And I do wonder, I mean, is this some modern form of gay conversion therapy? Because a lot of these kids are
definitely.
confused and they're gay.
Yeah.
And they're being told, no, you're not gay, you're in
Well, you know
wrong
sex.
sex.
The world's capital for sex change therapy?
Probably Iran.
It's Tehran.
Yeah, because you can't be gay, but you can be trans.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's worth thinking about for about 5 years. Yeah, no kidding. That's really something. Like, who would have ever guessed that was going to happen? Yeah. Right? That's so miraculously surreal. But yeah, it's a huge problem. Sure, if you're a confused adolescent, one of the potential sources of your confusion is, say, your homosexual proclivity. Well, that's going to add to your doubt about the viability of your biological form. It's like, well, under the surgeon's knife for you. Oh, it's a complete catastrophe.
It's a catastrophe, but it has so captured the culture. I mean, up until recently, until Elon Musk took over Twitter and reinstated your account, we'll talk about that, but you couldn't even state certain biological facts on Twitter without being permanently banned. I mean, this is things that are very much mainstream thought are almost taboo to say in the media or social media. How do conservatives, how do people who believe in biological fact fight back against this?
That's generally a local question, right? Because usually when a problem like this makes itself manifest, it makes itself manifest in the particulars of your life. So maybe you have a child who's now exhibiting signs of gender confusion because of what they've been taught at school. Well, now you've got yourself a problem. So how do you solve it? Well, who sits on your school board? Is it you, or is it the person to whom you've abdicated responsibility because you were so cynical about the political process that you never participated? So here's a rule. All the political responsibility you abdicate will be gathered up and used against you by those who are tyrannical. Right. Well, so do we maintain our civic responsibility in the West? No. So what happened? Well, the petty tyrants gathered all the power to themselves. And now you have a problem. Your child is deeply and suicidally confused and being aided and abetted in that confusion by people equally confused and also malevolent. Well, now you got yourself a problem. What do you do about that? Well, who knows? Do you take your child out of school? Do you start to fight against the school board? Do you learn to be articulate? Do you adopt your civic responsibility? Do you take politics more seriously? Do you stop thinking that the domain of ideas is only for eggheads? You know, there's lots of soul searching that needs to go on when you see this sort of twist in your society.
But the Conservatives have for a long time almost vacated the field when it comes to the so-called culture wars. And we have seen the left's march. It's not just through academia anymore. It's in private institutions. It's in corporations, Hollywood. So is it far too advanced for there to be a correction or a reversal?
No, there will eventually be a reversal. The question is, how much intervening damage are we willing to sustain before that correction occurs? And the answer is, you know, people say, well, the pendulum swings back. It's like, yeah, sometimes when it swings back, it has a razor's edge. And it takes a lot of people with it when it's swinging. You know, Venezuela will eventually correct course, but how many people will die as a consequence? So that's not a useful solution. What's the solution? Do you have something to say that you're not saying? If you do, then it's your fault. This is your fault. It's your problem. And you might say, well, I'm too afraid to talk. It's like, fair enough. How afraid are you not to talk? You know, people say to me frequently, they compliment me on my bravery. And I think, you don't understand. I'm not brave. I don't like conflict. I'm way more afraid of losing control of my tongue than I am of the consequences of saying what I have to say. Because I know what happens when we allow other people to control our tongues. It's not good. It's not good. It's hell itself. And so, of course, it's troublesome to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune when you say what you have to say. It's like, that's fine. Try not saying what you have to say. Well, that'll be okay in the moment. It's like, yeah, in the moment. But unfortunately, your whole life isn't in the moment.
No, but you can understand. Like I think I can understand why people still hesitate, whether there's someone with profile or someone who's just on a Facebook page and they don't want to state even a very mainstream opinion that's not progressive, because there's a real cost there. And is the cost worth saying what you feel?
Well, that's one of the fundamental questions of life. Is that, well, so we have a sense in the West, there's a doctrine in the West, very central doctrine. It's associated with the idea of logos and the divine word. The truth will set you free. Well, true or false? You might say, well, if I say the truth, I'm going to get into trouble. Fair enough, but if you abide by the lie, you're also going to get into trouble. And so one of the things you can do instantly is disabuse yourself of the notion that there's a zero trouble pathway. It's like you're in trouble both ways, like real trouble. You get to pick your trouble. That's all you've got. You get to pick your trouble. Now, in my situation, the situation my family has been in, we've been subject to intense attempts at cancellation dozens of times. Some of them of ridiculous intensity and duration. And we've learned that if we had been careful, and so that's important, I do my best not to say things that I believe are false. And so generally, it's been very difficult for those who want to cancel me to actually point to something I said to manage the cancellation. And so that's been very helpful. That's a matter of stepping carefully. But we've also discovered that if we can tolerate the strain without an apology, let's say without backtracking, it will inevitably reverse. Not just not work, that's the Streisand effect, right? But reverse. So the people who've come after me most harshly, in some sense, Kathy Newman, say on Channel 4, which was kind of comical, and then Helen Lewis for, I believe it was GQ, I think that interview has 50 million views. And so she did everything she could to lay serpentine traps for me. And it was very stressful and very high intensity dance, because if I would have said the wrong thing, all the moral virtue would have accrued to her and I would have been done. But the consequence instead was that she was my best friend, just like Kathy Newman was. And so you might say, well, if you say what you have to say, and I would say, don't just shoot your mouth off incautiously. There's no sense getting fired stupidly and leaving your family to starve. You have to be strategic about these things. This be a lifetime commitment, not a momentary whim that now you're going to, bumble out the truth. It might be a little late for that in your situation, right? But you have to decide in your life. You have to decide. Are you better served by the truth or by the lie of silence or deception? And those are your options. That's it. That's all you've got. And I believe that it isn't even so much that I believe that the truth will set you free, although I do. I know for certain that it's adherence to the lie that produces the totalitarian tyranny of hell. I know that for certain. The core of the totalitarian state is the lie. And then the degree to which you participate in that, with your silence or your outright falsehoods, is the degree to which you are an avatar of the spirit of the totalitarian tyranny. And that's, if you have any degree of insight at all, you see, well, that's something hellish. That thing that has dominion over you, that temptation to lie, that's the spirit that rules over hell. Well, you should be way more afraid of that. And I mean, infinitely more afraid of that. The truth might strip you bare, but if you fall under the dominion of the ruler of the pathway to hell, there is literally nothing worse than that. And you might say, well, that's hyperbole. It's like, really, it is, eh? It's 100 million dead under Mao. Hyperbole, eh? I don't think so.
Well, we've got right now this fascinating phenomenon. World's richest man saying he wants to restore truth to Twitter and trust to Twitter.
Yeah.
It's the public square now. It's how people communicate, find news. You were personally impacted by Twitter's left-leaning, censorious ways. You've now been restored. What impact do you think Twitter becoming an even playing field will have for...
Who knows? I mean, I'm hoping... I know people who know Elon Musk very well, who've worked for him, and these are very able people, to say the least. And they really admire him. He has the ability to do exactly what he did. He went into Twitter and he said, he's a good observer of the Pareto principle. A small minority of people do all the productive work. It's like, all you people, you're gone. And he just does it. It's like, and everybody who's whiny and complaining whines and complains about that. And no doubt some people who were doing a credible job were also let go. Because it's a pretty broad swath, let's say. But he's got rid of 75% of the people, and Twitter is still working.
With record traffic.
Right, exactly. And so I think he will, and apparently he's also put the boots to the people who are trafficking in child sexual exploitation already.
Incredible.
2 weeks. Right, no kidding. No kidding. Incredible in two ways. Incredible that he did it, but even more incredible that he could do it that fast and that it hadn't been done. Right, right. So, and Musk also, it seems to me that the evidence is quite clear that he not only has a pretty good eye, but he is capable of learning. So he'll experiment and he'll learn from his experiments, and we'll see if he can clean up Twitter. That's tough. I'm afraid, deeply afraid, that virtualization enables psychopathy, and that might be a fatal problem socially as we move towards a more virtualized world. It's not easy to keep the Machiavellian, psychopathic, narcissistic sadists under control. They're a small proportion of the population, but it's all about them and their short-term needs, and they'll do anything to make those paramount. It looks to me that when we virtualize the world, we take all the constraints off those people. And that's not good. So, for example, on social media, all the power's in the hands of the accusers. Wow, that's not good. You know, believe all women. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Except it's believe most women. As soon as it's all, it's like, yeah, well, what about the psychopaths? Well, they don't exist. It's like, oh, you wouldn't say that if you ever met one. So if you think that all people who are malevolent are only victims, you're naive and fortunate, and you better wake up, because one of these days someone like that's going to come and knock on your door, and you are going to be one sorry person. So, and it's very difficult to keep that 5% of the population regulated. All their regulation is external, because they have no internal regulation. And I don't see that we have any ability to regulate that online, and we reward it, right? We reward it with attention, we monetize it. This could be... See, I actually think that's what's driving polarization. I don't think polarization is real in some sense. I think it's all driven by undue attention paid to dark tetrad, Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic sadists. And that's polluting, because they communicate in an untrammeled manner in the virtual world. And because we're so virtualized, we think that's how the world is. It isn't. But we're reacting to it as if it is.
Is there a disproportionate number of those people in the media, perhaps?
Oh, definitely. Oh, yeah. Anywhere where there's a lot of public attention available. Yeah. Politics, entertainment, media. Anywhere where people have the privilege of being in the public eye. Yeah, that's exactly. The psychopaths will invade that for sure. Now, that doesn't mean that all the people in those industries have that characteristic. I would say that's a lurking temptation for people who have a talent in that direction, right? Because every temperament is going to come with its own temptations. And to be a person like you, say, although I'm not saying this about you necessarily, although it's probably true about you too, is that you're very likely to be extroverted and disagreeable. If you weren't extroverted, you wouldn't have that verbal fluency, and you wouldn't be comfortable in the public eye. And if you weren't disagreeable, you wouldn't challenge people. Okay, so what's the problem with being extroverted and disagreeable? Well, it tilts you towards narcissism. Now, there are ways that can be regulated. Maybe you're enmeshed in good social arrangements, right? So you have a husband, say, who helps keep you sane, and children and friends, and they help box you in. And maybe you're conscientious, and so there are, and like I said, every temperamental variant has its attendant temptations. But it's definitely the case that social media rewards disagreeable, extroverted people, and it also disinhibits all the temptations that are associated with that. It's not good. And the research on this is becoming quite clear, by the way. So we know that female hyper users of Instagram are also, they're sadistic, Machiavellian, psychopathic, and narcissistic, and they optimize for short-term mating strategies. So they're promiscuous, and that's a marker for antisocial behavior. So antisocial people, broadly speaking, have more sexual partners. They start engaging in sex earlier. They're more callous in their utilization of themselves than others. And so...
Would you call that toxic femininity? Is there such a thing as toxic
absolutely.
femininity?
We know what toxic femininity is.
Okay.
It's the female version of antisocial behavior is reputation savaging. Yeah. Gossip, innuendo, backbiting, and females can be very good at that. Now, men can do that too, and they do, especially on social media. But it's definitely the case that social media enables female antisocial type behavior, clearly. And so it scales. We were talking about, whether the feminine ethos scales. Feminine pathology scales magnificently on social media. And so God only knows what the consequence of that's going to be. And that's part of cancel culture. It's like, well, we can't confront you directly, but we can sure take you out behind the scenes. And that's, everyone familiar with junior high culture among teenage girls knows what that's like.
Absolutely. Now, one last question on climate change, because you gave that brilliant speech. I just want to know how, I want to ask about the psychology around climate change activism, because it's become an issue of morality as opposed to practicality. And how, again, do conservatives combat this notion that if you're not doing everything you can to slash emissions, then you're morally compromised?
Right, you don't care about the planet. Well, you ask more intelligent questions. It's like, well, what do you mean care about the planet? First of all, that's pretty vague. It's like, you really think that all of our problems can be reduced to excess carbon dioxide production? We have other problems. Well, here's a problem. 20 million people die a year because of indoor pollution. Well, is that a problem? It's a way bigger problem than climate change by the looks of it. Is it a big enough problem? Well, if not, there's others. Lots of children are still starving. We could provide them with nutrition at a fraction of the cost that we're planning to expend not doing a very good job of mediating our carbon output. I think the central issue for conservatives is to stop allowing the radicals to exploit you on the guilt front. It's like, no, you're not moral because you think that the apocalypse that confronts us can be reduced to a single variable, that you know what the variable is, because that's how wise you are, and that you know what the solution to that is. End all fossil. The apocalypse is all carbon dioxide and the cure is end all fossil fuels. That's what you think, is it? You know what that means? That means you don't think. It doesn't mean you're moral. It certainly doesn't mean I'm immoral if I oppose you. We've got way bigger fish to fry than problems on the carbon dioxide front.
And yet, you look at the UN, you look at the global leaders, this seems to be the number one priority. And we are seeing entire...
That's all that psychopathic virtue signaling. Poll-driven. I know how these politicians operate. They operate on the basis of they abdicate responsibility to idiot opinion polls. And so they stupidly sample public whim and then craft their policy to magnify their attractiveness to that whim. It's so appalling. I know perfectly well that that's what crafted COVID policy in Canada during the pandemic. It wasn't science. I know the people who were advising the people who were making the policies. It's like, was any of that science? No, it was all opinion poll. It's like, what? Really? Yeah, it was all opinion poll.
But does that scare you that there's that polling would show that these illiberal policies, the human rights breaches were so popular?
Yeah, well, people were afraid and they stampeded, you know. And what happened was we fall prey to the first actor phenomena. So there was a pandemic and it was an unbound problem. How serious is this? No one knows. So it's an apocalypse, right? An apocalypse, I suppose, is a problem of unspecifiable significance. It's a new apocalypse. What do we do about that? Everything we can. What does that mean? Well, we don't know. So then the Chinese totalitarians act first. Lock everyone down. It's like, oh, we better lock everyone down. Brilliant. You know, have you looked at the death tolls in Sweden during the pandemic? They're among the lowest in the European Union.
And their excess deaths are much better.
That's right. They don't have excess deaths because they didn't destroy their healthcare system, not stopping the pandemic. Yeah, it's appalling. It's appalling. It was another indication of the collapse of sophisticated policy making into a virtue signaling unidimensional problem. It's like, it's all about COVID. It's like, yeah, really. Not heart disease, not cancer, not chronic illness, not the socialization of children, not the education of children, not the supply chain, not the maintenance of the economy, not unemployment, not the ballooning of the debt. None of that. It's just COVID right now. And isn't it so interesting that because it's just COVID, we get all the power? Yeah, well, you know, excuse me if I'm a bit skeptical of your motivations. And we can still see the same thing unfolding in China. They're just doubling down. They still have a zero COVID tolerance policy. It's like, great. It's exactly what you'd expect from the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you think what we did during COVID could usher in our version of a social credit system?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, that's highly probable.
And that it will be accepted by many people because, again, that
they won't even
yearning
notice.
For safety.
They won't notice even. Yeah, you can't believe how much people don't know these things. When I went to the UK, I talked to some people from the House of Lords. This is within the last 6 months. The most astute of the people sitting in the House of Lords had only become aware of the woke movement in the last 18 months. Oh yes, you just can't believe how much this is not on people's radar. Not someone like you can't believe that at all because it's on your radar all the time. That's not, you live in a world that's on the cutting edge of this sort of thing. It's like, people have no idea. It's like, well, why not have a digital passport? I mean, you know, how convenient. It's like, fair enough, and you can understand that. Wouldn't it be nice if we could pay for everything with our phones? It's like, wouldn't it be nice if the central government, who's woke-oriented and makes carbon dioxide remediation the priority, knows exactly what you spend on everything so they can target you tax-wise with precision? It's like, oh, didn't think about that. It's like, yeah. You sure didn't. And oh yes, it's highly probable. It'll be a miracle if we escape from that. You can see these signs of this everywhere. You know, when you go through airports now, there's a lot of automated barriers. You show your passport. It's like, well, these are automated barriers. What if you can't go through them? Well, that's the situation for many people in China. It's like, what are you going to do? You're going to argue with the machine? Like, you just cannot imagine how screwed you are. It's way worse than anything Kafka ever imagined, because at least with Kafka, there was bureaucrats. Faceless though they may have been, they were at least still human. Once the machines can lock you out, you are in such trouble. And we're speeding towards that with an immense lack of care.
Jordan Peterson, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for the interview.